Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Think Tank 2022 public lecture series. This month, we have pleasure and honor to have Dr. Vida Vanchan. She's a professor of geography and planning and political science and public administration at State University of New York, Buffalo State. She holds a doctoral degree in international economic and business geographies and master degree in international trade from the University of Buffalo, as well as bachelor degree in business management from the Metropolitan State University of Denver. Dr. Vanchan research focus on economic and social development, manufacturing and reshoring, global supply chains, configuration and sustainability, industrial competitiveness, and competitive characteristic of firms, trade and investment, cross-cultural management and negotiation, and emerging economy in Southeast Asia. So she has published many book chapters, books, and journal articles on topic relating to global supply chains, economic geographies. Her latest publication was on the ordinary cities and extraordinary geographies, people, place, and space. This month, we have also great honor to have Dr. Soksipana as the chairman of the Asian Vision Institute to join us, giving a special opening remarks to this public lecture series. So without further ado, first I would like to invite Dr. Soksipana to give special opening remarks, and then would like to invite Dr. Vida Vanchan to give a presentation.
Well, thank you, Van Ruth. Thank you so much for the kind introduction of Dr. Vanchan. Hi, Dr. Vanchan. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. I know it's the end of the year. I know it's snowing hard in New York, but look like you have a good background of a tropical ocean side, so it's quite a refreshing view. That should be the site in Cambodia now, not in New York, okay? But I'm very pleased that we are able, toward the end of the year, to organize this last series of webinar online, and the topic is very interesting. I would say it's more than interesting. The topic is very crucial, particularly for the manufacturing industry who are now struggling in the context of a very decoupled world. You know, I mean, the last several years has not been kind to the industry, particularly with the COVID. COVID in itself is a big disruptor. But we have also the geopolitical tension between China, Russia, the US, and the European Union. All this it does not bear well for the economy per se, particularly in the context of economic fragmentation. You know, we have a company who are struggling to support their supply chain, that sort of thing. Here we are talking about a major paradigm shift in terms of industrial and manufacturing development. And I think Dr. Vanchan can give us a good synopsis on what she thinks is happening in that particular sector, and particularly on how companies are, you know, struggling to build or rebuild or reconnect their supply chain. Recently, we're very happy to hear that China have lifted the COVID restriction. So, but I would say it's still going to be a while before supply chain is restored or reestablished. But I read with great interest the paper and the research that Dr. Vanchan have written on this notion of so-called outsourcing, offshoring, all these new acronym. I think we have to get used to that. The other thing that I find very a bit worrisome also is that, for example, in the European Union, some country, in particular Germany, start to come up with laws that sort of like will, in a way, affect the supply chain in the sense that they want a due diligence on human rights, on environmental aspect. And the European Union, as a union, is contemplating passing similar law. In the US, you have the Inflation Reduction Act. It's forcing company to take side. I don't know. I think the prospect of the world is a bit gloomy, but I hope Dr. Van Chan can share with us a bit what she think, the industry will shape up to be, how company, particularly in Cambodia, as you all know that Cambodia is a trading nation. We have thrived, we have grown on trade. So anything that's happening in the international trade will have direct impact on our economy, on our poverty reduction effort, on many social aspects. So I think I would want to stop there and allow Dr. Van Chan to carry on. And I'm quite keen to hear what she had to say. So Vandret, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saksipana, for giving us the kind of the introduction and the setting the tone for our public lecture series today. So, Dr. Vanda,
Van Chan,
Vida, please.
Vida Van Chan, yeah.
Vida Van Chan, yes. Please start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So, first, I just like to thank Dr. Chiang Wanarit for organizing this and for the introduction, and then the remarks from Your Excellency, Dr. Saksipana. And I'm honored to be able to share part of my research findings and information that I have done researching for quite many years, and to be able to give this opportunity. I use this background, as I said, it's the disguise of trying to be there with you all in a tropical country. I know some of my colleagues and friends here are joining us from the States. We have experienced a tremendous blizzard, which is unprecedented. And my sympathy and condolences goes into those who have lost their lives. There's over 30 people who have lost their life. So this is really a very hard time for us here in Western New York. And it's an illustration of crisis, and it's somewhat of a natural disaster and how that affects everyone's life. And that brings me to the opportunity that I get to talk about it today, and dealing with the companies, dealing with individuals. So it's not just applying to the companies, but also individuals, institutions, states, and how we manage risk, and how we actually think about, reconceptualize the process of production, understanding the global economy that we all connected. So with that, I am going to share my screen. Let me just see here if I'm able to do that. Just bear with me here. So can everybody see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Trying to get to the slideshow here. All right.
Great.
So, okay, so this is the title of my talk today. So it's about, as I mentioned, it's about global economy and then geographies of production during crises. And I would like to start with giving an introduction as to what motivated me into actually doing this type of research, and then sharing the information, and kind of introducing a field that has been overlooked, and in my opinion, I'm biased, is a field that really enables us to actually see what's going on beyond just a particular discipline. And that will lead to a little bit of introduction of the work that I've been doing for quite a few years, and then more detailed information about research, the latest in publication and latest research that I have been involved in, and to really start with the basics of how we understand the economy and what the economy is about, and then the global economy, and then geographies, because as you know, you all in the audience and everybody knows, and particularly in growing up in Cambodia, I remember that this is not really a field that was quite popular, and then also in the US as well. But it's really when we talking about location, when we are focusing on the differences across space, on different economic activities, different processes. And so here's about understanding locations of production and the economy and what goes into the production and manufacturing, as Dr. Saxapana just mentioned earlier. It's all about the inputs into creating wealth, creating the economy, and then the shift, what had been changing, and then the challenges that we all have been facing in these recent years, that there and there's more to come, unfortunately. But how are we preparing for that, and how are we actually understanding the foundations into those shifts, and then create the challenges and moving forward, which will lead to the conclusion that I would like to offer some of the suggestions as far as the solutions in dealing with these the changing geographies of production and changing in global economy, and then what we can do as the way how we apply what we know now, and then all these different components into our individual lives, into businesses, into institutions, into states, and then moving forward into the future. So as Dr. Ching Van Rit mentioned earlier, these are my the background of my education, and this actually has broadened my understanding and my research in different areas, because I went to business school. I also got into geography, which was a field, as I mentioned before, it's not a field that's super popular, but it's quite interesting to me to actually see how interdisciplinary this is, and the importance of looking into different processes, which I will explain later. So it's really opened up and broadened my understanding of different things over the years. So I've been teaching at Buffalo State since 2006, and before the pandemic hit, it was an opportunity for me to combine what I've been doing over the years in my research and my teaching by co-teaching a course in Cambodia, and it's an opportunity for me to be back in Cambodia. And it was a great opportunity. It was a course that I co-taught with a colleague at Cornell University on the contemporary Cambodia. We look at labor, development, and society. So the pictures that you see there are the pictures of the students that we brought with us to Siem Reap, and then we travel across the country into the city and kind of looked at the country as a whole, as far as the development goes, history, labor, and society. We had the opportunities to meet with various ministries, and then the ministers of different ministries, including His Excellency Wong Sod at the Ministry of Social Affairs, His Excellency at Samhain at the Ministry of Labor, His Excellency Ham Van Di at the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And then we also met with different institutions, labor unions, and along with the visit to the factories and talk to the workers. And so this actually gave a lot of information, a lot of insight into part of the global value chains that I'm going to talk about, the whole production network, the changing geographies of production, and combined with the areas that I've always been interested in. One of the focus areas in my research on development, economic and social development across scales. So scales here meanings that it goes from local to a regional level. So there was other parts that I always interested in, and as economic geographer, and the ones that have been exposed to these different kinds of scales, we are interested in looking at development across these various parts of the economy. And the latest research that I've been involved in, and this is the one that I'm pretty excited and hope that I will get the opportunity to talk about this in the future once we get that published, is the research that I've been doing with my colleagues in the UK. And this is part of understanding the reconfiguration or configuration of the global supply chains and sustainability in eco-activewear. And so the eco-activewear industry is the industry that was booming actually during the pandemic, and it's over $500 billion. And it includes everything from sportwear and people wear to their athleisure is another part, which is the subsector of activewear. And I personally work out quite a bit, so I wear a lot of the leggings and other parts that really bring is the part that we are trying to understand how this particular sector reconfigured that whole global value chain. So where do they manufacture, where do they produce, where do the materials come from, and from the beginning till the end, the consumption, the post-consumption, the circular economy part of it. And then the disruptive firms, those small firms, they're not large, they're small firms, the firms that are able to disrupt the market and gain competitiveness in the markets. And so that's the part that I have been doing research in the last 2 or 3 years. And as you can see there, the manufacturing industry, and obviously I am shamelessly promoting these books because I think they are quite critical in understanding the economy, the manufacturing industries. And as Dr. Supana mentioned earlier, that manufacturing, and this is one of the main arguments I have today, is that manufacturing continues to be an important part of the economy. Although developed economies such as the US has become what we call deindustrialized, and majority of the workers are in the service sector, but manufacturing is still critical, and there's an advanced manufacturing. So there's many policy, many initiatives, and going into reinforcing that particular sector. There's many subsectors, sub-industry within manufacturing. So this handbook is very comprehensive. It took us many years to put this all together. I contributed several chapters in introduction conclusion as a co-editor, and also my personal chapter on design. And I will get to talk about that as well. The industrial design firms, the companies that design everything from furniture, clothing, the textile, color patterns into airplane parts. And so they become quite sophisticated, quite innovative. I had the opportunity to travel across the United States to take a look at these innovative companies, to interview them. And so they're really, really critical parts into understanding the structure of manufacturing and just one component of manufacturing. So this handbook offers all of these different pieces and written by experts from all over the world that are giving us the information regarding to the manufacturing industries in the world economy. And so from there, I've done research on the trade and investments. I did a study on the geographic patterns of foreign direct investment in the US for over 10 years. So pretty much I looked at the patterns where the investments, foreign direct investments, had been in the United States over the years. And that was the period that I did when I did my master. And so there's always been my interest in looking at trade, looking at investments. And then the latest one on that Dr. Ching-Wan mentioned about the latest book that got published on ordinary cities, extraordinary geographies. This is the first time that I wrote about Cambodia, and I wrote a chapter on Siem Reap. And so the whole point of the book is to really generate this debate around the cities, and not major cities, smaller cities that are critical cities that have been overlooked. And how do we define ordinary versus extraordinaries? So there are many different ways into understanding the moving pieces, the foundations of the larger cities, the supporting systems of the larger cities. And a lot of those have not been studied, because a lot of places, a lot of publications, a lot of initiative have been centered around bigger cities. And so we're trying to make this argument that, hey, look at all of these smaller cities, the history of all these cities, and why they need to be brought into the conversation when we are looking at the urban system as a whole. And so this is the book, and we are actually working on the following the follow-up book on the different challenges and issues related to city. And so with that brings me to the part that this is the sad part, obviously. It is something that we have witnessed over the last 2 years, almost 3 years now, that we all have experienced the effects of the pandemic. We lived through it. Our lives, the work, the businesses, all have been altered in the ways that were unprecedented. Of course, some countries did better than others. Some individuals adapt better, but we all know that this pandemic has affected every one of us, has affected every part of our life. So the world is still reeling from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I speak, there's situations in China, right? So this is something that remains to be seen. The high infection rate, Cambodia is doing a great job in coping, and that was an example. There's a piece that was written about it way back when the pandemic hit and during the first year, and this is something that I will actually talk about a little bit too, of how the ASEAN, right, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have done a really great job in having high vaccination rates in mitigating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But overall, we know that there's been significant effects of the pandemic, economic and psychological effects. There's hardships that have been echoed through different societies across countries. And with this, that we can see that the economic growth is not expected to be at the high level. Obviously, the global economic growth is projected to slow down quite a bit. So we are going to see slow economic growth for the world. And according to the World Bank, the projected growth for next year is going to be around 3%. And then for this year is about 2.9%. And obviously, that's something that slowed down from 2021 when it was projected at 5.7%. As I alluded earlier and mentioned earlier about the ASEAN and the ASEAN +3 here, meaning ASEAN and China, Japan, and South Korea. AMRO, I'm sure there are people in the room, and Dr. Sipana can jump in and highlight this, the expert on this, and can mention and elaborate on this much better and much more detail, that for ASEAN, the growth rate is still at around 5%. Right? So if you compare the ASEAN projected growth to the global growth, obviously it's higher. And it's higher because one of the main reasons is that the countries in ASEAN and ASEAN +3 were able to have these high vaccination rate, and that's part of the strategy. So did I go back to what screen? Did everybody see my screen?
You keep going. Next
Okay.
next few screen, yeah.
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 More. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. That's it. Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to see if I'm able to get some. Oh, please.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, that technology there. Yes. So the growth rate for for the ASEAN countries, projected growth rate is higher than the global growth rate, and just because one of the contributing factors with the countries that were able to give higher in terms of vaccination rate, and also because of the preparedness, and there is some debates around that as well. But overall, according to this AMRO report, it's these macroeconomic civilian organization that try to contribute to the to be an advisor to the ASEAN +3 region, is that they really alluded and attest to the fact that the ASEAN +3 and ASEAN in general have this high vaccination rate. But the outlook is not going to be that great because of the war in Ukraine, as we all know, that the war in Ukraine, although doesn't have that direct exposure to the ASEAN and ASEAN +3, but the economic fallout from that affects the countries in Southeast Asia, affects the ASEAN +3. So the fallout in the form of high inflation rate, the slow growth, the disruptive supply chains, and all of these would hurt the economy of ASEAN as a whole, because there's high export rates, and because all these countries are interconnected. And so all the countries are going to be affected one way or another. So what I am trying to say here, and I think everybody here understands, is that regardless of a situation or something that happens in other part of the world that you don't have that direct exposure right away, or you don't have the direct impact, eventually it's going to affect, and especially when we have this global connected economy. And so the conflict in Europe further proved the vulnerability of the global peace, the economic stability, and sustainability. And it's hard for the economists to predict the future cause of war, but there is a consensus that its long-term effects, which will be long-lasting for those directly involved and indirectly shared by those that are not. So we can all feel the pains, obviously, with the rising energy costs. And that's another thing that was mentioned in AMRO report as well, that the high energy costs are one of the economic fallouts and the pains that the countries in Southeast Asia fell, and consumers fell as well. And here in the US, we can all feel it, because rising fuel prices, there are public anger over this. The politicians are trying to cope with this, and they're trying to kind of intervene and calm the voters when there's election. We just had the mid-election in the US. So there's a danger of losing control in power, and it affects the policy, it affects the future strategies and policies of various countries. And so by looking at all of this, my position, as I said from the very beginning, is to demonstrate the fact that this is a circular process. This is circular and interrelated processes that explain the very nature of each economy, and how economic geographers and how the work of an individual such as myself help understand, and we are in the position of trying to examine all of these. And so let's start by understanding what the economy is and what goes into the economy. And then we'll get into the focus, where I mentioned in the title of my talk is about the geographies of production. And so what is the economy? The economy comprise the interrelated processes of production, circulation, exchange, and consumption, through which wealth is generated. And so that's what economy is. And as I said earlier, it is the circular process, interrelated processes. And so in each economy, there are factors of productions. Those are land, labor, and capital, along with some economists would say entrepreneurship and or knowledge, but most of the main three factors of productions are land, labor, and capital. Those factor of productions are what goes into the resources that go into the production system those are the resources that go into the economy. And so within each economy, we have to determine the way how resources are deployed, how work is organized, and then how wealth is distributed. And so when we're doing that within an economy, it's the mode of production. And so economic historians have identified various modes of production, which include everything from subsistence to capitalism. Right? So those are different modes of production. And these modes of productions, in each mode of production, there's a distinctive relationship between the main factors of production, as I mentioned before, land, labor, capital, knowledge, or entrepreneurship. And those relationships of the main factors of productions have changed over time. So when we're looking at labor, when we're looking at land, when we're looking at capital, and then the knowledge and how knowledge has expanded over time, the spirits of entrepreneurship within individual economy, those are the moving parts, and those are the things that make up the factors of production, and that are being organized through these different modes of productions. And so with that, we have the different modes of productions, and then we have the complexity of the economy and the complexity of the production system itself. And so with these changing relationship over time, right? So the changing relationship within the economy, the work that I do is to actually point out to the differences in those different economic activities. What I am saying here is that the work of myself, along with the people in my field of study, what we are interested in is to seek explanations to the differences in economic activities. Economists, we have certain common areas with the economists where people would create the model and seek generalization. And for the people such as myself, and this is another part that I would like to highlight, is that we are interested in explaining the process, right? Explaining how economic processes play out in differentiated space. So with that, space and place, along with scale, are crucial in our analysis. The place, space, and scale, these are other terms that are used a lot in economic geography, in my area of study and my work. And a space is just an open area, is an area on the Earth's surface. A place is specific. A place is something that people become attached to it, endowing it with meaning and significance. And then scale, as I mentioned before about my research and my interest in development, the scale varies from local to global. So, right, so we're looking at local scale, looking at regional scale, national scale, global scale. And so space, place, and scale are crucial in my analysis, crucial in the work that we do in understanding how economic processes play out in differentiated space. I am explaining all of this because this will lead into what I'm trying to explain regarding the geographies of production. Right? So that's when you can see how those value chains to products are produced at different areas in different parts of the world, in different parts of the countries. Why are they locating there? Why are they choosing? And Dr. Sapana mentioned earlier at the introduction about the way how these are organized, right? So how we see all of these different parts that goes into the economy, and so when we're looking at space, place, and scale, they are crucial in our analysis and also the key actors of the economy. So those key actors within the economy are the firms themselves, the states, so firms here, the companies, the businesses, states, countries, individuals, workers. And so these actors operate in their respective space, place, and scale, and they contribute to an overall understanding of the global economy. And so we know what the economy is made up, all of the components that goes into economy, the different modes of production. And so all of these key actors are crucial in our understanding of the economic activities in various places and various countries. And then we can look at those activities at different scales. And so my talk is focused on the key actors within the production framework. And so I keep saying production, so this is a crucial component within the production framework that drive economic growth. Okay, so I said this before, that manufacturing is really an important part of the economy. It's manufacturing has gone through great transformation, and along with how this whole restructuring of the global production system, right? So the focus here is on that framework, within that framework of the production framework that drive the economic growth, and by highlighting the fact that we have seen this evolving nature of geographies of production. The supply chains, I'm going to focus on the part that we have seen a shift and changes within the supply chains, the disruptions that occurred and have occurred in recent years. And then the management part, so how we manage these disruptions. And this goes beyond just in individual firms themselves. It goes into the workers, which are us, that we are working and we are part of the society. The labor part goes into the states, the governments themselves, how they institute policies that fit into the whole production system that kind of generate the way how resources are organized, are deployed, right? So all of these are part of my focus and part of what I am trying to convey today. So I am going to start with a little bit of the literature background here on the geographies of production. So changing location, changing geographies of production. So how do we understand that? Why do companies choose a particular location to manufacture their goods? Why do we have textile in Cambodia? I'm sure you have answers. Why do you have all the garment sector, in less developed countries? It has to do with the spatial division, international division of labor. So the theories behind all of these different ways of how the production is organized can be explained into these three different approaches. And so I am going to introduce three different approaches in understanding geography of production. So the first one here is the one that emphasizes the importance of local agglomeration. So that's some literature there, and I'm going to explain each one. The second one highlights the interfirm mechanisms. And then the third one here, it explains the global relationship of global production network, global value chains. So these are the three different approaches, contrasting approaches into understanding the geography of production. So how does each one really explain to us about the geography of production? The first one here highlights or emphasizes the importance of agglomeration. I'm sure some of you have heard this word before, know what it is. And so this is the part where companies, businesses benefit from locating close to one another. So there's agglomeration, it's a cluster of activities, cluster of firms. And there's many different ways of looking at this, and economic geographers have written quite a lot on this part. And so the clustering of industry develops the kinds of savings that companies get by being there. And I am going to give specific example of the work that I did for quite many years on industrial design firms that I mentioned before. Design is critical, and that's my argument again, that it is critical everywhere. It is not just a process that creating something that looks good. It creates this economic part. It makes it easy to use. It has certain benefit. It's also contributing to what we now know as the green product, right? So there are many different kinds of products. So industrial design industry that I spent many years studying comprise of all of the different elements of companies that design everything, as I said, from furniture to clothing to airplane parts to electronic gadgets to toys to many different things. And these kind of firms highlight this one approach into understanding geography production, because they mirror the manufacturing itself. They mirror the production system. So you would find the textile designers, the textile designers located in New York City, in Los Angeles, in the garment district. So when I did my research, I did go in to talk to those companies. And so you would find, the resources that are there, the students, the skills that the companies need are there to support them. And so this is a kind of agglomeration that generate the saving, the external economies, the saving for the companies by locating there. The automotive designers, those designers that design automotive parts, part of cars, the look of the cars, all of these different components that goes into the cars, they are in Michigan, they are in Detroit. And if you read about automotive designs, companies and big autos, companies in the US, you would see that's the auto capital, because there are other states that have automotive manufacturing factories, but it's that place that is important, that generates this agglomeration. That emphasize the importance of agglomeration. And that's one of the approaches into understanding the geography of production. And so you would not find the companies that specialize in furniture design located in Detroit or in the Los Angeles, for example. And so again, these evidence of that particular production, that particular activity is explained in the form of agglomeration economy. And so moving from there into the second approach into understanding geography of production is the intra-firm mechanism. So this is another approach by scholars. There's so many literature written about this as well, into understanding geography of production. So where do we, again, in a simple term, where do we find production of a particular product, right? Why are they there? What caused them to be there? And so this second approach looks at the internal mechanisms of firms, right? So intra-firm meaning within the firm. And so when firms have this capability of expanding, of reaching new markets, and again, there are different theories that goes into explaining this as well, the circuit of capital theory, the product cycle theory. So when the product reaches maturity, obviously that can be produced at a low cost location. That's when company needs to tap into new market, that when they internalize their production or externalize their production system, that's when they outsource, they offshore, using different strategies, right? So this kind of activities goes into these internal intra-firm mechanisms and explaining the geography of production. And companies or firms gain efficiencies from both internal and external economies of scale. So when they are able to tap into new market, when they can use their internal resources to expand, all of these different things lead to the new production plan leads to a new location, new expansion. And so this explains the geography of production. And that brings me to the last one, the third approach into understanding the geography of production is the global relationships or global production network. So when companies expand, when they have enough resources, the companies that I've studied, the industrial designs, going back to the design firms, those firms that I studied their competitiveness. So what makes them competitive? Why are some companies more competitive than others? There are around 3,000 or so companies in the US that are industrial design companies that are under the North American classification codes as the industrial design companies. And the companies that exhibited high growth are those that invested in human capital, those that invested in technology upgrading, and then have contract research and development. And those that exported also exhibited faster growth. And so all of these different elements goes into the second approach in understanding geography production, but also leads into the way how firms internationalize. Right? So when they are able to tap into cheap labor, for example, in less developed countries and why Cambodia is chosen this location to produce certain products, so clothing, the shoes, and recently the bags, right? We have certain competitiveness in Cambodia. There's certain elements that make Cambodia better for both of these companies, providing them cheaper cost that goes into their whole cost structure system that makes it easier for them to pick the country over another country. And of course, all of these elements have changed over time. And this is a part of what I am going over here as well in explaining this whole geography of production, because there are other parts and that really changed this whole form of the location. So companies would move away from Cambodia to elsewhere, depending on their strategies. So depending on all of these different moving pieces, the companies, many of the US companies have already moved their operations and try to cut down that dependence on China, on their production in China. And so that really underscores the third part here on the global relationship, global production network. And this global relationship or global production network is another approach that really highlights this continued restructuring of the global value chains or global production networks. And it's one of the major manufacturing transformation. This process involves outsourcing, offshoring, and that's Dr. Sipana mentioned earlier about this, that all of these different strategies, the offshoring, reshoring, right shoring, or best shoring. So these are the different strategies that are associated with this major transformation in manufacturing and the whole restructuring of the global value chains, or the global production network. And so in this process, all of these different strategies include the application of new technologies as well. So we cannot detach the technologies part out of this. I mean, I'm able to give this talk because of the technology. And this is why it is critical that we have all of these different strategies, but we also have the technologies, the application of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, robotics, and autonomous systems, the RAS. And so all of these different things. And I recall one of my trips in the past to production site of Ford automotive company, and one of their plans that they manufacture F-150. And I was there with a conference with a group, but we got to see this whole assembly line and how one of the workers explained to us how the technology really replaced some of the workers that they needed to be there to be part of the assembly line, and how they actually streamlined the whole production process, and how that was able to move things faster, and then they don't need the individual to really put the front windshield on because they have these robotic arms that they use in the factory to put all of these together. And so these different applications of the technology, along with the artificial intelligence, robots, all these systems goes into the strategies in reconfiguring, restructuring of the global production network, global value chains. And this revolution has altered the whole geographies of production. When we look at reshoring, in one of the papers that I wrote regarding reshoring of the US and the UK companies, that is sector dependent. So a lot of times people getting excited, oh, we're going to have the jobs back into the countries. We're going to have the new manufacturing plant in the country that move away from another location. But again, how is that benefiting the individual workers? Because having a new plant doesn't mean they're going to have the same number of workers, because the robots, some of the robots can do a better job, and we have replaced the workers. And so we need to think about them as a whole complex system into understanding the whole geographies of production. So manufacturing has transformed the relationship between worker, and machine. And then this whole revolution has altered the existing geographies of manufacturing, and at the same time, transform workplaces. And so the existing literature that's in the field out there has been on looking at the commodity chains or the global production network literature, focus more on the governance, but they underemphasize the dynamics of the whole production network. My argument with my colleagues and my co-author in our papers that have been published in recent years and in our work is that we need to look beyond, all of these different parts of the literature. Right? We need to really focus on the engage further into more operation focused account of these global production by really emphasizing the very processes, the very tasks in creating, or the decisions at the sub level that goes into the micro, macro decisions at each of the production system. And so, in other words, what we are arguing, and what I'm trying to argue today in this talk, is that the global production is the outcome of an accumulation of many incremental micro and macro decisions made by individual firms and governments. So again, it is an accumulation of the macro and micro decisions made by individual firms and governments. And so this accumulation include the decision that determine the subdivision of tasks and their geographies that lie above the production process. So this not only reflects on an ongoing evolution of spatial division of labor. So as I explained before, how the headquarters have more skilled workers, and then they have subsidiaries, and then other branches that have workers who perform different tasks. So this goes beyond, that reflects beyond this whole spatial division of labor, but also the balance between variable and fixed costs, between labor and machines, and then artificial intelligence. What I would like to point out here is that firms, workers, and governments are in continual process of becoming. And that's why economics as a field is an art, because it's very hard to predict individual behaviors. We are quite interesting creatures as humans. There is a lot of complexity that goes into it. And so when we look at individuals, when we look at individual workers, when we look at firms, when we look at governments, we are in this continual process of becoming. So this is simultaneously social, political, cultural, and economic, especially during time of crisis. And so this is something that, in many different elements that comes into play. So as such, this requires an understanding of the impacts and underscores the need for effective pandemic or crisis contingency plan to be developed. And so with that, I am going to get into the part that I'm going to discuss risk, the disruption associated with global supply chains, and then the management part of it, and then offer in the end some of the solutions and leading into the discussions, and then how do we manage the risk and how we understand risks and values. And so during this global pandemic, the growth in the global economy faltered. We are still reeling from it. We have all been affected by it, as I said before, and everybody in this room, in this webinar, knows very well. It affects us on many different levels. So the policy choices for people involved in government and creating policies have become very difficult, right? With limited room to maneuver. All of these uncertainties, very hard. And we have these uncertainties. We now still have uncertainties if you're looking around what's going on in the world, right? The war in Ukraine, the recent rises in COVID rates in China, the tensions among countries. And so with all of these uncertainties, they can be described as being part of what my colleagues, and who's super brilliant, and who wrote a book, John Bryson, on this COVID-19, and who label this whole new era in which we live as what we call Jenga capitalism. For those of you who have played Jenga, you know what it is. It's a game with the blocks, and you try to, take them one piece at a time, and it becomes unstable. Right? So what he called this as Jenga capitalism is that it is an era, it's an epoch that represents a new form of risk society, where globalization combined with technological convergence has led to new forms of non-calculable uncertainty and instability. And so this is what Jenga capitalism is about. And just because of all of these uncertainties, that we have this new risk society where we have globalization combined with the technological convergence, that a lot of us in the room, and for the economists, very hard to predict the actual effects. Try to quantify it. We try to quantify it to the best that we can, but there's a lot of unknown. There's a lot of uncertainties. So this Jenga capitalism represents this new form of risk society, where globalization combined with technological convergence has led to these new forms of non-calculable uncertainty and instability. And so with that, what does that tell us? I mean, what do we know, and why do we want to focus on geography of production? And I hope that by now that we have an idea of what the geography of production is, and what it means, and how that affects the economy, affects the individual. But again, if we look at further into the way how people behave, how we spend our money, right, for the US in particular, that during the pandemic, people spend a lot more on physical goods. And so again, this is my focus and the areas that I like to highlight, the fact that people still want the physical products. They care about getting the tangible goods, and those goods are produced by someone, by somewhere, by certain location, with certain individuals. So in the US, goods have become this focal point of the global supply chain crisis, because people spend much more on physical goods during the COVID pandemic. And actually it was the rate, the way how people spend it was reported as having an increase of close to 15%. So it was 14.5% increase on consumer spending on goods compared to only 2% increase on services. And so the physical goods, the goods part, the spending on goods was much more prior during the pandemic than before the pandemic. And the US as a country has imported a lot more goods as well. So when we're looking at trade, and of course, US always has trade deficit. I talk about this all the time, that we import more than exports. And that's not a good thing. But there's a lot more, and that's why U.S. is a major market, because the consumers spend more, we buy more, but we'll also import a lot more. And there's rising imports of goods, reached, you can see the percentage that was reported there, that the imports were up 17% in 2021 compared to those during the same time in 2019. And so during the COVID time, and we, almost 3 years now, trying to come out of it, still experiencing this global supply chain disruptions. And at one point, for those of us who are joining here from the US or have been reading the news on this, that there's these grim reports about children not getting their toys on time for the holidays, about people not, and of course the reports and the actual things that happen, that not having enough, the PPE, the personal protection equipments, the basic necessities, the food supplies, the toiletries, so all of this. And so these kinds of things related to industrial production that was impacted due to supply chain bottlenecks. And so what caused all of this? What caused the supply chain bottlenecks? Because it's really because of the problems at the ports, the no workers, again, the labor, the land, the capital, all of these, the factors of production that goes into the economy play a role here in explaining this particular part of supply chain disruptions. So the supply chain bottlenecks here in the forms of like new cars, computer chip shortages. And so the world's delicate supply chains have been under extreme stress because of lack of workers, mentioned before. The port pile up, there's not enough workers there. The President Biden administration did try to intervene, work with the private sector, including Walmart, in trying to increase the operation hours. But there's been problems in the countries for a long time now about not having enough workers, not having enough truck drivers. And so we have this kind of shortage in terms of the labor supply. And then the computer chip shortages, which is the part that goes into different kinds of devices as well. It goes into cars and computers. It's also the medical devices. And so the short-term and long-term key measures were identified by the U.S. government, President Biden, and in trying to mitigate this, but it's not the solution, the best solution for everything, because this is a systematic problem. It's not just a one part thing. And so when we're looking at the supply chain as a whole, there's been this paradigm shift that goes into the delivery system. We've seen that companies have moved from just in case to just in time delivery. So just in case meaning they're producing everything just, so that you have enough when you need. Just in time is the efficient production, which is you produce it according to the customer needs. But then when we have these shortages, when we have these disruptions and all these problems, we need to really change this whole paradigm, which is the paradigm shift from just-in-time delivery to resiliency. And in order to move from that to resiliency, it requires technological improvements. It requires the investment, so industry investments and labor union participation. And so all of these, and there's been a lot written about this as well, the op-ed, there's different opinions on by the experts in the field. These different parts are good, but they're very hard to do. I mean, for companies to upgrade their whole supply chain system, they're making this technological investment, making the industry investment, getting involved with labor, trying to get people to work in longer hours, and especially during the pandemic and all of this, very hard to do. And so the war in Ukraine didn't help either with the disruption, because for the companies that needed to export and to move or transport their products from Eastern China to Western Europe, they had to find alternate routes, pretty much to bypass Russia and Ukraine to transport these products. And they reported, and so I listed there, the laptops, the smartphones, cars, auto supplies. And so the disruption in all of this caused kind of a domino effect, and it affected everyone. So these type of things represent, so the disruption represent risk. Right? So they represent risk that associated with the global production system. And so how do we really conceptualize these whole value and risk with the current production framework, as well as identifying the key operational strategies in risk management and national security? And then so that's what I'm turning into now. And so what I propose in the chapter that I wrote, and also in the previous papers, is that we have to think about, of course, we're living in a global environment, we're living in a global world, but we also need to combine the two elements. We need to think about the concept in a strategy that's called glocalization. And glocalization is this whole reconceptualization of globalization and localization in the global production networks to avoid disruptions, manage risk, and then increase national security. And so this is an alternative pathway, in my opinion, to configure the whole supply chains and production management. How do we do that, right? So when we were looking at this, when we're combining globalization and localization, what are the things that we need to do? Here is that for companies, we need to balance the risk versus reward, right? Cost control versus non-price-based forms of competitiveness. And so I am going to talk a little some more about this, because how do we determine value? How do we determine risk? Do companies to think about the profit alone, or we need to think beyond this? And what my argument here is that it's beyond just the price forms. It's beyond just the cost control. It's this total management, cost analysis that involve value, the non-monetary values, that involve the environmental components, that's also involved the microbial, all of these different elements that have to be taken into account rather than just a profit-driven ways of thinking in conducting business, and especially given the era in which we live, and where we're moving into the future. And so when I'm talking about this alternative pathway, it's not just for the companies themselves, it's not just for the business that are involved in the production system. We can think about it and expand it into our own, ways of looking at things, right? As an individual, as states. So when we are an individual, when we are working for a company, when we're working for an institution, how do we really think beyond just, the cost component, and really factor in all of these different uncertainties? And as the policymakers, as the states, right, how do we actually calculate beyond just creating economic growth, creating the fact that, okay, we have experienced this high growth in numbers, the quantitative measure of performance. How about the qualitative rather than just quantitative part? And then how about reducing it into promoting more of the security side of things? And that's what I am getting into next. That's what I said before in the beginning about the situation among many different American companies that have changed their strategies by relocating, moving their production, or reconfiguring their geographies of production because of the risks associated with their operation, and because what we have witnessed and have seen in recent years, and starting with the heighten of the trade war between U.S. and China. So since the trade war, the heightened trade war between U.S. and China in 2018, more American companies have decreased their dependence on the Asian market. So, for example, in 2019, Abercrombie and Fitch, which is the American lifestyle retailer, casual wear, they reduced their dependence on Chinese suppliers by more than 40%. The Hasbro, which is a toy company, they shifted their production away from China to Vietnam, to India and Mexico. And their plan was to reduce the proportion of toys that come from China by 1/3 by 2023, which is next year. Intel, in March of last year, announced that they would pump some $20 billion into two new semiconductor plants in Arizona. And I just read recently about that as well, that they're trying to compete to get contract with Apple, because Apple is trying to get the Taiwanese semiconductor firms producing in Arizona, and trying to manufacture chips here in the US. And it's going to rely on the US chip production system rather than the production in China and in other, pretty much in China. There, the General Motors, another big company, is reshoring their battery production to Michigan, where a new hub for lithium-based products is to emerge soon. Another company, such as the U.S. Steel Company, has decided to build its new $3 billion factory. Instead of building the $3 billion factory abroad, they built it in the U.S. And in Alabama. And so these are all different examples of how the companies have restructured their geographies of production, and how they have moved their operations from other locations back into the countries, into the U.S. So Reshoring Initiative is an organization that reported all of these different activities by the US companies. They reported their, since 2010, there's estimated about over 1 million jobs that have been brought back to the US because of the reshoring activity. And as you can all see on the screen here, there's they reported 1,800 US firms that intended to actually bring at least some, if not the total business, but at least parts of it back to the US. And so these different activities highlight the strategy that called reshoring. And reshoring is not a simple concept. It's not a simple process. It's actually a complex process. And I co-authored a paper on that about reshoring, reshoring activities by the US companies and the UK firms by my co-authors in the UK. So we looked at both Americans and the British firms who have moved their productions back into either one of the countries, and we look at the whole concept, the drivers behind those activities, behind the global production network. So reshoring is not a simple concept. It's complex that requires a whole understanding of different sectors. So it's sector dependent. So depending on what you're looking at, which sector of the economy, and it's also driven by these manufacturing cost management and quality strategies that combine with the importance of manufacturing close to the market. And so that's always been, the one of the ways that how companies want to be closer to the market, and especially during the time of crises, that you can see why the companies are more motivated to be closer to home because of the logistical problems, and because the whole supply chain disruption here has really have motivated a lot more companies to think about producing locally. And so here, these whole combination of these different strategies involve this total manufacturing cost analysis that I mentioned before, in which access to a set of tangible and intangible inputs are key drivers behind the dynamic of the global production network. And so with that, we're going to talk about, what this whole total manufacturing cost analysis is about. Okay? So the total manufacturing cost analysis is about having this access to a set of both tangible and intangible inputs. And they are the key drivers behind the dynamics of global production network. And so when having these access, the companies have to think beyond just, maybe cheap labor. They have to think about, how the quality of the products. They have to think about how to reach the consumers and how soon they can reach their consumers. So all of these are sector dependent as part of the strategy. That leads to another another term that used for this kinds of strategies called right shoring or best shoring. So the right shoring or best shoring is when firms identify the best fit between the location, the business function, and the purpose or the value proposition. And of course, I know I have limited time, so I can elaborate on that into specific industry, as I mentioned before, regarding the eco activewear. And so all of these strategies, what we know is that there's a labor that is a critical input. Right? So we have to think about people. And I cannot say enough about what people goes into all of this, that we are the central part of all of these different economic activities, and the strategies evolve around the labor, and also made up of these labor parts. So the US has been facing labor shortages, particularly in the manufacturing sector, for many years. And so with the pandemic, what we have experienced is what we call the Great Resignation. which means that there's reported of many people quit. They just quit their jobs. In 2021, there as many as 4.5 million people in the US quit their job. And so the problem with the labor, in terms of the labor shortage in the US, is not new. This is just one piece of the puzzle. But what made this interesting and what brought this into the forefront was the fact that during the pandemic, those people who quit at a very high rate were those that work in the sector or the industries that affected us individually. So the accommodation, the food services, the truck drivers, all the frontline workers, all of these people are critical. They are essential workers. And when they quit, it's really affected everything. And so that's brought it to the forefront, and why the country was recognized as, oh, wow, we have a problem. There's a great resignation, and there's a labor shortage and a skilled labor shortage. And of course, US is not alone. I'm sure in Cambodia, there's situation about skilled labor shortages, about problems with finding the skilled labor to work in a particular industry, or how to improve skills to fit a particular needs, right, within the country. And so the way how we look at this is that the institutions, the businesses have to find ways to motivate their workers. And so in the US, the younger workers are more likely to quit, especially those that they work, and so they have to find, there's many different attributes, and a lot of papers written about this as well, ways to motivate workers so that they can stay with the job longer. And so this whole point, when we go back to what I proposed earlier about globalization, is we think about it within this context, it's really heightens the need to balance the economic value with the values related to reliability. So if you own a business, if you own a restaurant, you can't find the workers to work, how do you run your business, right? So it is part of that whole reconceptualizing process of the production system, that we need to balance the economic value with the values related to reliability, resilience, and location. Might not make as much money as before, but you need to keep these employees. You need to find ways to motivate them. You need to find the location where you can find these employees to work. And so all of these point, it's really brings me to the conclusion that we are vulnerable. So vulnerabilities across space, place, and scale. We are vulnerable as individuals, as businesses, as organizations, institutions, states. And then it's really underscores the importance of manufacturing. The role of manufacturing as this transformative force in economic growth. So despite the fact that many developed countries have moved away from dependence on the manufacturing sectors, their products are being produced somewhere by organizations, by companies, and all of these, and now we have seen an increase of promoting manufacturing, and there's the advanced manufacturing agenda. There's the White House that got involved. For example, President Biden, which is earlier this month, was with Apple CEO talking about this whole new plan of the chips production here in the US, and how those chips gonna be produced by the Taiwanese chip conductor. It's one of the largest firms in the world in providing the chips, but or the processors there. But they are critical into supporting this one large corporation, Apple, and others are bringing themselves into the forefront too, in supplying the products. And so manufacturing is critical. It's critical in any societies. And with that, the geography of production requires a comprehensive understanding. That's why I started with the basic and understanding what the economy is, what goes into the economies, how everything interacts, this whole circular process. and of all actors within the economy and at all scales. That's why I said again about the space, place, and scale, that we need to really explain the processes, how the process played out in all of this differentiated space, and more on the operation focus. And in developing this understanding, the solution is first is to really think about, the production system as a complex task. And this includes the appreciation of operational tasks and both qualitative and quantitative drivers behind the geography of production. And so mainly we have to think about, the importance of manufacturing products close to the market, about the cost management analysis, the quality strategies that I outlined it before. So the set of tangible, intangible inputs that drive the dynamics of geography production. And then the COVID really, emphasized, and I said again, the way how we look at risk, how we evaluate risk, the risk that comes in different ways, and how we balance value and risk. So a lot of times companies are thinking about, the profits and being profit driven. It's beyond that. It's we need to really think about the vulnerability that we all face in the society, economies around the world. The main argument of how we really find the way to respond to the risk, to manage risk, and also deal with the national security. So a profit focus as a driver behind the whole configuration of value chains we talked about before, of finding cheap labor, tapping into no market, getting new access to a new market, expanding on the operation, need to be balanced with the concern for other values, right? Other values which include both monetary and non-monetary values. They include balancing profits with environmental impacts. And that's why we have a lot of agenda out of the UN as well, and different initiatives in thinking about the environment. So profit with environmental impacts. Firm, individual, and institutions and countries need to reevaluate their priorities and reconfigure their operations and long-term goals. So in some, values need to be analyzed further as value for whom, what, when, where, why, and how. So from the risk perspective, it's similar that way, right? Risk for what, whom, where, and when, and how. So we can try to balance the profit with risk, the risk that applies to all levels, internal and external. So I label this endogenous and exogenous. So internal risk, external risk, to individual, to organizations, to nations, and they need to be understood to include those that are something that we don't see, right? So microbial risk, for example, and there's a literature that wrote about that as well. And the third point of this is that the pandemic and the recent war in Ukraine have taught us as well to be aware and better prepare in time of crisis, including identifying the vulnerability. So where we are most vulnerable, right? How do we manage the risk? Any crisis response requires ongoing and rapid improvisation. So we need to improvise. We need to do this on a regular basis and rapidly, cannot just sit and wait for things to happen. So my proposal about, thinking of this alternative pathway of globalization that it not only, the really help us see the ongoing global supply chain crisis, the production problem, but the issues surrounding the resources, consumption, utilities, and management. And it also further demonstrate the need for reconfiguration and rebalancing of value and risk, as well as the role of state in responding to the crisis and their performance. So in the end, when we're looking at all of this, that short-term and long-term approaches need to be considered when responding to an ongoing crisis. So my last slide here is that overall, only time can tell how we respond to all of this, how all of the economic actors manage risk and how fast the global economic recovery will unfold. But we should be certain that these risks are not a single phenomenon. So something that happened as we're eventually going to affect us, the environmental impact, certain waste pollution that happens as we're going to impact us eventually. So a sound crisis management plan needs to be developed regardless. So that's pretty much it. And thank you so much. I think I've gone a little bit over time here. I thank you for paying attention. This is quite long, and I hope that everyone got the information, and thank you for paying attention to this. And these are all my references. And again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vida Vanchan. Very informative and insightful lecture presentation. You mentioned a lot with regards to the kind of geography of manufacturing, global supply chain, outsourcing, reshoring, even friendshoring. Friendshoring is also a new concept. To avoid certain geopolitical risks. So some countries may choose their partners, strategic partners, allies, in order to relocate their production bases. So it's not only purely about economic and production, but also political and security to some extent. I would like to pose the question with regards to Cambodian context. So over the past few years, Cambodia has been trying to promote this concept of Thailand +1 in order to attract certain foreign companies, especially Japanese companies, to relocate some of their production networks to Cambodia. And Minibear have proven to be one successful case in this kind of reshoring or outsourcing from Thailand to Cambodia. And Cambodia is become a supplier of parts and components to the automobile industry, for instance, in Thailand, which is being led by Japanese company. Another concept is Vietnam +1, because Vietnam is also a production hub for a Korean multinational companies, including Samsung and LG. And of course, we need to connect in terms of logistics and transport. So you mentioned about the production agglomeration and a cluster concept of clustering here are very important, but it's not yet been so successful, the Vietnam +1. And some people even talk about China +1 after we signed the China-Cambodia FTA. So maybe some foreign companies or even Chinese company can relocate to Cambodia and supply part and components to their main factory in China, because we have FTA and so on. So those are the kind of a strategy of Cambodia have been introducing so far. And lately also there's some efforts to develop this kind of SME cluster. But maybe Dr. Suksipana can share with us, it seems that not really a successful project, the SME cluster, spearheaded by one private company in Cambodia. So my question to you, you're putting Cambodia in the context of this kind of shifting global production network, supply chains, and the complexity of interconnectedness in the region, especially after the conclusion of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Partnership. So what are your recommendations to Cambodian government as well as the private sector? So what you call it, the localization of productions and in the context of regional and international connectivities?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question and very insight information into what's going on in Cambodia as far as the strategies. So those are the things that really underscore the fact that I was presenting today about this geographies of production, right? So these different strategies are the strategies by the firms themselves, and these strategies altered the whole geographies of production. And for it's not something that is solid at one point, because certain locations, you mentioned that some strategies work, some strategies don't. And so in my research, we'll look at the company's decisions and what we propose, as there are different strains of approaches into understanding geography of production. Agglomeration is one, right? So agglomerations that companies would choose to be there because they get it, by being benefits, the saving from being at that particular location. Another is through this intra-firm mechanism. So the things that they have internally that generate the savings for them. And then the third approach is through this global relationship network that you mentioned. And so the firms themselves and all of these literatures, all these strategies are the different strategies, but in the end, it comes down to that operation focus, right? So the micro and macro decisions, and that what we propose, and my colleague and I, and in our study, in terms of developing this conceptual framework and understanding the dynamics of global production network, is that it's not just the governance part, right? When you're talking about the country, the country try to couple their decisions, like doing the coupling of strategies, to be partnering with a country that's been successful in producing a particular part. It's not just that. It has these micro and macro decisions that goes into the task level, and then that lies beyond a production line. So we need to separate those and develop these whole conceptual frameworks in understanding that. And what I said about globalization is about how you combine this globalization with localization, that there's this total manufacturing cost analysis, the access to both tangible and intangible. So it's from the company perspectives, and from the country's perspective, you have to, of course, there are you all are experts here. You've been doing research and look into all of the different ways in attracting investments. But also, when we look at the picture, is that if all of these decisions are based not just solely on costs. When the companies in the U.S. that move back to the country, there are other factors that influence their decisions of moving back. Right? Companies that make money, not only profit driven, but they have this social responsibility. They want to make a products that people are purchasing. The consumers in the end have a say that we're buying products that are made in the U.S., made in America. And so I know it's a long way of getting into the end, but what I'm saying is there's no solid strategy. What you're trying to stay away is trying to just not just following the trend and improvising and coming up with something that just attract an investment at a particular point. You have to really rely on what the core components, what make that competitive edge, right? What make Cambodia the destination for this particular company? What do we have that Vietnam doesn't have, Thailand doesn't have, right? Or how do we compete in that if they come up with a different way? Because all of the countries in the end are competing for all of this, right? I'm looking at the textile sector, for example, and in the eco-active wear, these companies that we call disruptive firms, right? They are small firms, but they're not the giant firms like Nike or major companies, but they have different value propositions that are not mainly driven by profits. And so they have this niche market. They produce products at smaller scales, and they contribute, attract customers because of that particular value propositions, that they reduce waste, they use recycled materials. And so they gain some momentum in capturing a niche market and capturing consumers. And a lot of these, have some, they have their factories inside the US or in the Europe, or for my European counterparts who study the European firms. But they also have some of the sites that sources of the cotton or the raw materials in other countries. And so again, it's about finding that balance and exploring, the ways that giving the country that competitive edge that, not everybody is able to do the same thing. And this is when that particular scale comes into play, that differentiated space that I mentioned before, that makes it different, because it's not just, international division of labor that we talked about before, that company just go to cheap labor place anymore. And there's Sarosh Karavilla, whom I co-taught the course at Cornell with, has written a book on this particular, textile and labor, with the labor focus and how these different factories are being audited and how they meet with, the goals, the standards set up by these major firms, and then they having a hard time in terms of, reducing the cost, right? So when the cost rises, these companies are looking for cheaper countries, that cheaper places that offer, the cheaper products for them to generate more profit. So it's all about looking into this different assets that the country have to offer, and then balance between monetary and non-monetary values, and look beyond just the quantitative measures, but qualitative measures. And a lot of what I can say from my research is that a lot of firms, industrial design firms that I've studied and the firms I looked at, those that are successful in the long run are those that provide quality, the quality products, quality services. They don't have to be the ones that provide the cheapest products, provide the quality that keeps the consumers coming back. And for the country, you could look at it in a similar way, that the products that are made, the quality is beyond just, if they move elsewhere, they can find cheaper place to produce it, but they're not going to get the same type of products that they would have in the country. I know it's a long answer, but I hope it's
let me interject a bit. Vanret, Dr. Van Chan mentioned about reshoring, offshoring, bestshoring, all this new concept. But there's one thing that is interesting that she highlighted, that these are all sector specific. So it's not across the board. It's not across the board. So in this case, in the context of this economic fragmentation between the East and the West, the US, China, whatever, I think at this moment, it's still at the very high-end technological side of it. Okay, it's the Taiwanese company moving to the US to manufacture microchip for Apple. These are very high end. But in the context of our economy, which is still pretty much predominantly garment, footwear, travel, good, labor factor play a major role. In fact, when 4 years ago, when I was asked by the government to be the special envoy to go to lobby the European Union not to cut a tariff preference, my main pitch to the European Commission was that, look, if you remove a trade preference, you're not going to hurt us. You're going to hurt the 800,000 female worker in the factory. They will be the primary victim of your decision to remove a trade preference. So labor is clear. The role of labor is very important, and ultimately they only cut 20%, a partial withdrawal in a way. So it's not so bad. But the other thing I want to point out in terms of the strategy of, say, in this case, Japan, for example, when you look at Vida talk about this the geography, the space, the location. all this year that I have worked with the Japanese government, the Japanese have a very clear view on how they see the Mekong region. I have not seen from the Chinese government. I have not seen from the Vietnamese government, but clearly from the Japanese, they map a Mekong region. This is the before Myanmar crisis. Huh? This is the before Myanmar crisis. Now you can remove Myanmar out the equation. But we still have 4 countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. How did the Japanese map? They map as if we are one sub-region. Well, you know, flying from Siem Reap to Bangkok is only half an hour flight. So basically, it's closer than Dr. Van Chan flying from New York to Virginia. Okay, something like this, right? So we have to look at this notion of space quite in a relative way, right? So Bangkok, Phnom Penh, Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, Vientiane, they're all part of one sub-regional. And from there, the Japanese map, what does Cambodia has, what does Thailand have, what does Vietnam doesn't have, and then they do a strategy. And what you mentioned, mini beer, is quite an interesting thing, because now the factory that produce in Cambodia, they make all the electrical harness, and they ship it to Thailand to assemble into the car. You know, the harness that you connect to the steering wheel, you turn left, the blinker, turn right, whatever. It's all assembled in Cambodia. And it's interesting because they say that one time I was a bit shocked, because they say, well, you know, Cambodia worker are a bit slow, you know. Vietnam worker is a bit faster. And then I was a bit shocked. And then he said, no, don't take it wrong, because sometimes we need some slower hand, because when they assemble this electrical harness, we don't want, you know, the red cable go to the green cable, you turn left, and then instead of turning left, you turn right. So there are some good advantage of this sort of labor aspect. So all I'm saying is that labor is a critical factor in this equation. Ultimately, how Cambodia will navigate will be in this part of the world. I'm not talking about the US. I'm talking about the East Asia. The regional comprehensive economic partnership will be a major game changer for our region, in the sense that, you know, for the first time ever, we have a mega free trade bloc of 15 countries, 1/3 of the world economy, situated in Southeast Asia. So I think there's a clear competition, of course, with the TPP, the CPTPP, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I still feel that the prospect of Cambodia economy in terms of trade, we're still not there to cause a friction, to cause a threat to the global economy, whatever, because we're still on the lower end. You know, when you manufacture footwear, garment, and travel bag, these are very labor intensive. And that's why in the ASEP, it's a lot of a recommendation that we have to move up the value chain a bit, yeah. But I do appreciate Dr. Van Chan's presentation. It's very detailed, very scientific, and I hope some of our, you know, listener, viewer would try to understand better. But I seriously would recommend that those who love to read on the weekend would read Dr. Van Chan's paper. I really enjoyed the paper on what you wrote, yeah. So, but it's a bit deep, very academic, but very essential for a company strategist, for a government policy maker to understand the dynamics of all of that. You know, it's quite clear. We are not alone. We are part of this global chain as a country, as a company, and I like Dr. Van Chan referring to the microbial thing. So it's at a so micro level, but at the microbial level. But this is quite interesting, yeah. So I will let other people to jump in, yeah.
Thank you. There's a question from our audience here. Yundi Bun, Mr. Yun UD Bun.
UD Bun, yeah.
Yeah, UD Bun. So he asked, while the supply chain is being reconfigured, do you think that the price of goods is expected to increase?
Vida,
Yes.
Yeah.
So the supply chains involve everything from the birth of a product to the end to the consumption, and it's in the continual process. So it's always, changing. And so the price of the goods, there are many factors. I mean, it goes into making products, and price of goods. If you're asking that is the goods, the price of goods going to increase, that depends on what type of goods again, right? And also, if you're living in society now, we know that because of the war, because of the pandemic, they really have cost, the products cost more to make. There are the inputs that goes into making those products, so the part of the economy, there are many different moving components, so they all add up into what comes out in the end, right? So of course it's depending on the goods, but it's very likely, because of what we have witnessed and what we encounter, is a lot of uncertainties, that products are much more expensive than they used to. And of course the economists can provide much more explanation to this, but that's a simple version to that. It's it related to inflation, right? And how countries cope with the inflation as well.
Thank you very much. Now I think we have come to, I mean, maybe 5 more minutes for us to wrap up our Think Tank 2022 public lecture series. So the last question here is with regards to again the public-private partnership. Perhaps you could provide some recommendation, because of course we have public-private partnership kind of forum annually. The government receives some feedbacks and so on, how to improve productivity, how to further increase the value chain that Dr. Soksipana mentioned earlier, because we need to move from a textile industry to more value-added manufacturing industry. So can you give us a recommendation how to make this form of a public-private partnership to be more effective with regards to the development of the manufacturing sector in Cambodia?
So I think Dr. Sipana can can provide a better answer, much better, much in-depth answer to that. My little humble opinion here is that any partnership is quite complicated. I mean, there's no great model there in using this, having this effective partnership. And so one ways of looking at this is there has to be mutual benefits, right? So it cannot be just benefiting one side versus the other. And so when you're thinking about partnerships, it's about the mutual benefit, and then ongoing communication, and so there's an application, and then I major advocate for that. So you can come up with all kinds of theories, all kinds of policies and ways that are wonderful, but if they're not put into place and not in being enforced and apply, they just sitting there. And I am the evidence of that, as guilty of that as an academic, right? So we write papers, we provide all of these wonderful, in our opinions, that great ideas, but if they're not being used, that they futile. It's not. There's the problems within the field of geography itself is that there's a lot of wonderful things that are done, but we're not connected with the policymakers. They're review economists in the business world. They are more well aware of the professions. They're more well aware of these different recommendations, and you see the actual effect into the policies and how they work. but if there's no the connection, if you don't make that connection and they don't click together, then it's it's not working. So I know we have limited time, but I'll just let Dr. Sipana go.
Yeah, I think public-private sector partnership, yes, Cambodia does have a mechanism, but in the sector that Dr. Van Chan is mentioning, I think the focus will be more on the industry itself, because they are the actor. And I could say that I was a bit, looking way back to some 22 years ago when I was a Secretary of State of Commerce. That was a long time ago. The industry have grown, and I would say on the government side, we're more the learning, we're more the passive learning actor, because at that time we didn't know the specific of the industry. We were driven by the industry. However, this is where I see the role of a partnership, is that government are policymaker. We don't delve into the micro of the enterprise, but then we listen to what does the enterprise need from the policymaker to help their industry compete. And that was the time 20 some years ago when we, as a government, me, the Minister of Commerce, we went to US, we went to Europe, we went to Japan to try to raise the profile of the linkage between the respect of labor right and the export of garment. And that was the time of President Clinton. He was pushing this labor linkage, and in fact, it was that policy consideration that saved the garment industry. Because my pitch when I deal with the Adidas or of the H&M of the world or Zara of the world, to say, look, guys, in Cambodia, we're 16 million. At that time, it was 14 million. We do not have enough cheap labor for you guys forever. In China, you move 50 kilometers inland, you find another 50 million garment workers that will produce at much cheaper rate. So we cannot compete on cost with China. However, we will compete on the value proposition that we respect the labor law. We respect the labor right of the worker. We will link with the export of the garment industry. And in fact, at that time, the US government gave us a bonus of 4% for company who actually, annual quota increase, right? Who actually respect the labor law and the respect of the labor right. We even allow the ILO to come in and establish one of the best program, the Better Factory Cambodia, which now is about maybe nearly 15 years now, in 15, 17 years in practice now. So I think moving forward, it will be that same approach that will save us when the European Union, when Germany start to enforce the human right due diligence, the environmental right due diligence. So I think, yes, at the end, yeah, price matter, but again, I think we have to look at the value proposition that the state have a certain role that it can do and should do, but the rest, the productivity side of it, it's more the garment industry. And I was a bit unhappy that all this year, there's not much work done by the industry itself to build up the productivity sector of the garment industry. Of course, now they have a training center, that sort of thing, but it's a bit late. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Once again, we would like to express our sincere gratitude, appreciation to Dr. Vida Van Chan for
Pleasure.
spending your valuable time sharing with us, Dr. Saksipana for also attending this public lecture series. It's our great honor to have both of you together on this panel. And thank you all for joining us online, either through Zoom and Facebook Live. So thank you very much for your support and interest in learning more about the geography or economic geography of production networks. It is very rare for Cambodians audience to learn the global supply chain from economic geographer like Dr. Vida, because I think perhaps you are the first economic geographer, the
And
Cambodian.
I'm more of a hybrid too, because I'm not
Yeah.
really an economic geographer. I was in
Yeah.
business school, so it was
Business. Yeah.
a mixture of things. So and I think that's what
Yeah,
made it
yeah.
quite.
So very unique perspective, very insightful. I think all of us have learned a lot from you, and we are looking forward to meeting you in person in Cambodia. I think you would contribute more to the Cambodian economy and society through sharing knowledge and expertise. So we are looking forward to welcoming you to Cambodia, especially the AVI team are looking forward to meeting you to further exchange
Thank you.
perspective and knowledge and information with regards to Cambodian economy, and also the cultural management and so on, the urban planning, because you have written on Siem Reap as a case study when it comes to urban planning, extraordinary city development and so on. So I think you have a lot to share with us. So we're looking forward to that opportunity and taking this opportunity. Wish you prosperous and happy New Year 2023. So Dr. Vida, Dr. Soksipana, and all the participants here are prosperous, healthy 2023. So looking forward to our future think tank 2022 public lecture series in the next 2 months. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Great job. Yeah.
Thank you.